So, I don't know if you've heard this one, but there was an atheist who died, and just to great surprise, found himself facing St. Peter at the pearly gates. And St. Peter says to him, well, we know you don't believe in God, but you've lived an exemplary life. You've been an upright human being, and so we're going to let you in. And he opens the gate, and he summons an angel, and he says, now, take this fellow on the tour. So the angel takes the atheist under his wing, and they go into heaven. And he sees all kinds of people there. He sees Hindus, and he sees Muslims, and Buddhists, and Jains. He sees a lot of other atheists. And in the far corner of heaven, he sees this wall. So they get to the end of the tour, and the angel says to the atheist, well, do you have any questions? And the atheist says, yeah, what was that wall doing over there in the corner of heaven? And the angel says, well, the Christians are behind that wall. They think they're the only ones here. So, what begins our talk today is this concept of secularism. And sometimes, when you read about it, it's easy to get the impression that there's a wall that some people have built to say that, well, atheists are the only ones who are interested in secularism, which Professor Jacques Berliner-Blau, this fellow up here that I'd like to introduce you to, who also happens to be an atheist, argues is a very bad thing, not just for atheists, but for religious people and for anyone who wants to live in a democratic, pluralist society. So, I came across Professor Berliner-Blau's work as he was launching this book that he's come out with, I think, last month. How to Be Secular, A Call to Arms for Religious Freedom. Now remember, this man is a professed atheist. He also, though, happens to be Jewish and takes his family to synagogue twice a week. But he's an atheist. This fellow here, in the center, perhaps some of you will recognize, philosopher Charles Taylor, one of our leading intellectuals here in Canada, and also the co-chair of the Taylor-Bouchard Commissions in Quebec several years ago, which was investigating integration and assimilation, multiculturalism in Quebec. And he is the author of this weighty tome, A Secular Age, which is not quick reading, but it's very, very interesting. And in terms of an intellectual and cultural history of the enormous transitions that have taken place in the Western world around secularism and modernity, I can recommend no more thorough work than that. And finally, because I promised to talk about Islam here, I have a couple of other items. This book down here on the bottom, I will make some reference to. I recently read it. It's written by Doug Saunders, The Myth of the Muslim Tide. And he is the European bureau chief for the Globe and Mail, also an atheist, by the way. And he writes this book about how Muslim immigration into Western countries, North America, Europe, etc., is perceived and what the realities are. And he draws on a lot of statistical data. He's not interested in making sort of polemical arguments. He just packs it full of numbers. So he's got polls on there from Demos, from the Pew Forum, and many, many others. And why it's an interesting book is that it's very concise, very easy to read, lots of data, and this man does not have a religious interest in painting a very pretty picture of Muslims. He isn't one. He doesn't hold a candle for that particular tradition. So it's well worth reading from an outsider as an objective take on what the data says. I'll be drawing on some of that information in the comments that I make here today. And finally, this fellow up here in the far corner with the white head wrap. No, he's not a radical Muslim cleric, despite the traditional garb. He's Professor Abdullahi An-Naim, the Howard Chairman Professor of Law at Emory University. Very eminent, the author of several books, some of which I'll tell you about a bit later, and a leading proponent of secularism for Muslims. So, with that sort of overview, get right into it. What is secularism exactly? This is something that Professor Berliner-Blau argues is less and less understood well. The word secularism originally derives from this Latin word seculum, and it was actually a term that was coined by the Catholic Church in Europe to divide what they viewed as sacred time and sacred space from everything else. And so it principally applied to, for example, members of the clergy like monks who lived separate from the rest of us and devoted their entire lives and all their activities to what was deemed the sacred. In fact, the term to secularize would originally have been used to describe a monk who might have then decided to become a lay priest, because now he left the entirely sacred realm and did most of his work in the outside realm. So it originally had very different connotations. But this division between what is deemed entirely sacred, directed toward the otherworldly and the eternal, from that which is temporal and daily, the secular, was a church term originally. It's come to mean now the formal division of church and state, or in other words, the non-institutionalization of any particular religion within the state. And there are various ways of doing this. It isn't a cookie-cutter model, and I'm sure if you follow the politics, for example, in France, or in Turkey, or in England, all of these are technically secular countries, but their models of secularism differ one from the other. And that has a lot to do with the populations that they have, as well as the historical narratives that bring them to where they are. As Berliner Blau points out in his book, you can be secular in two principal ways. There can be a separation model. This mic not working, is it? Is it gone?
No, it's working.
The separation model is where the state has nothing to do with religion at all. The accommodation model is where the state may be involved with religion, but it must be neutral among religions. It cannot favor one over others. So in both, you don't have one particular religion that's enshrined with the authority and the official sanction of the state. Now, there are two sort of original models of secularism, which I'm going to use as contrasting paradigms here. And the first one is the American model. When the Americans got around to writing their constitution, they had a very specific set of concerns. A lot of them were religious dissenters from England who had been fleeing religious persecution there. And of course, England is a curious example of a secular state because the Anglican Church still is the official church of England. So it's technically secular, but in a very strange way. A lot of these founding fathers of the American Constitution wanted to avoid the institutional persecution of official religion. So if your particular religious views differ from what the state's version of religion is, you're in trouble. As a result, they were interested in the non-institutionalization of any particular religious group in the American Constitution. The idea of secularism there was actually intended to protect the freedom for religion. You could have whatever religious views you particularly wanted, or indeed none at all. But the state would not privilege any particular version and invest that with its authority and power. Now the French model is a little bit different, and it emerged out of the particular historical concerns of the French people, where the institutionalized Catholic Church played a very large role. Unlike the Americans were sort of starting from scratch, the French have this long history in which the church had a very, very heavy hand. So their model of secularism was much more anti-religious, quite specifically, and they call it laïcité, or laïcité rather. As a result, in France right now, the model of citizenship and the posture of the state towards religion in public spaces is markedly different from that which you will observe in America, where, as you know, even from watching the politics on the campaign trail the past couple of weeks, religion is everywhere present, but nowhere sort of specifically institutionalized as one version over others. At least that's the theory. Now there are distortions of secularism. These are the sort of misunderstandings that Berliner Blau targets in his book. Some of them are from the religious conservatives, who think that secular and secularism means that the state must be actively anti-religious, and that any religious expression of any sort in public space is to be suppressed, pushed out, and outlawed. And so you get these hysterical kinds of reactions from some religious fundamentalists who put out books like this, Sex and Secularism, what happens when you leave religion. You know, everything goes to the dogs. And so these are these hysterical sorts of polemics that are coming out. And unfortunately, they're on the rise in countries like America and other places. And then, of course, there are people who think that secularism means that any expression of religion in public space is bad. And for an example here, I have Pauline Marois, now, of course, not only the leader of the PQ in Quebec, but their premier. And her charter for secularism, which she touted on her campaign trail, involves, for example, that that civil servants are not able to have any garment or symbol which identifies them as being members of religious tradition. So if you're wearing a yarmulke, if you're wearing a turban, if you're wearing a hijab, whatever, take it off. Otherwise you cannot work in the civil service.
Protestant?
Excellent question. Now this is my problem with Pauline Marois, which is that in the Quebec Assembly, there's a very prominent crucifix that hangs on the wall. She was not interested in removing this. And her grounds for that were that the crucifix is now a cultural symbol of Quebecois identity. So while she doesn't view it in a religious light, it sort of exemplifies a certain tradition and identity that she wants to protect. And so the crucifix in the assembly is fine, but don't come in there with any other religious symbols. So, but you can see here that there are these two sort of polarized ideas of what secularism is supposed to mean. And Berliner Blau says this is a problem. Now, one of these faces I'm sure you're well familiar with. Mr. Richard Dawkins. The other one here, perhaps you may also recognize. Pat Robertson. Yeah, I cringe.
Same difference.
Well, that's what Berliner Blau says, as a matter of fact, is that he says that, unfortunately, there are activists on both sides of this debate, both on the far fringe of the atheist movement, or some of the new atheists, as well as in terms of Christian fundamentalists, who tend to be very, very loud, fairly offensive, and assured of their own rightness, also quite ignorant about the opposition. And he says that basically, you see more and more sound bites, more and more coverage of this kind of utterance, and it's not very helpful to people at all. And that it increases the confusion about what we mean by secularism, and it decreases our ability to work together as we must in our mixed societies for larger goals. I promised I would say something about Islam. So after talking about the misunderstandings of secularism in countries that have been secular for some years, let's now talk about Islam. Now, you'll hear a lot of things by people who say that Muslims cannot be secular, Muslims cannot be democratic, Muslims cannot be modern, and so on and so forth. And one of the objections you hear is that Islam is a total system. In other words, Muslims are unable to separate the political from the religious, and that Islam is this total system. If you're a Muslim, that's it. You're unable to understand these fine distinctions. Well, first of all, I would say that secular nationalism was indeed the model for many Muslim countries throughout much of the 20th century. If you think for a moment about Iraq, about Egypt, Syria, Iran, Turkey, and Tunisia, for most of the 20th century, these were secular countries. Back to that in a moment. That Islam as a total system is no more the case in that any religious believer is going to find that their view about God and about the truth of reality is going to tend to affect how they think about everything else, just as perhaps your own views about the nature of the universe are going to affect the way you view most things. It doesn't necessarily entail a particular political identity. Secondly, what about Sharia? You hear that Sharia is Muslim law. Well, this is a very interesting thing because, first of all, Muslims themselves can't really agree on what it is. You may or may not be aware, but there are many, many schools of law in Islam. I can name you 5 off the top of my head. There are the 4 Sunni schools: Maliki, Shafi, Hanafi, Hanbali. There's the main Shia school, the Jafari school. And there are many, many others. In fact, these are just the 5 best known ones. And each of these claim to sort of take the principles of a religion and try and translate them into rulings on how you should view your daily interactions with other people. So Muslims differ amongst themselves quite extensively about what this means, and sometimes they even go shopping amongst the different schools for ruling on different things. Secondly, the Sharia is supposed to be the ethical traditions of the faith applied to daily life. It does not necessarily mean that it has to be enshrined in the power of the state and the letter of the law. In fact, for much of Muslim history, it hasn't been the case that the state has gone around enforcing some version of Sharia. A lot of the Sharia talk is very, very recent, which brings me to the context of secularism, and to step back to these secular nationalist Muslim countries in the 20th century. You think about Egypt, right? And these women down here are recent protesters in Egypt during the Tahrir Square uprisings and so on. You think about Egypt, and as a secular nationalist country, you had that under Mubarak, you had that under Sadat. And the secular nationalism that they experienced was associated with authoritarian dictatorship and a post-colonial mess. Okay, and so it was that way in many other Muslim countries, Tunisia, Algeria, and so on. So what you have there is, unfortunately for a lot of people, the word secularism is associated with these very negative experiences. And then for others, they've bought some of the rhetoric that secularism means anti-religion or no religion. Not simply that secularism denotes a particular separation in the way that you organize the power of the state and the role of religion in your country. So a lot of the Islamist politics that have emerged recently are very much a reaction both to history and to recent political events. Islamists are basically, they want to combine the power of politics and religion in actually very new ways, which they present to their fellow citizens as tradition. We are defending the tradition. We are representing to you what you have lost. It's actually not true. They're combining these things in new ways, and they're drawing on the sentiments of people who are sick and tired of dictators in that area and the entire political system that was associated with them. Unfortunately, for example, in Egypt particularly, the First Lady, Mrs. Mubarak, was involved in championing some very important legislation for women's rights in terms of divorce. Now, because people have had enough of Mubarak, some of that legislation is under attack by people who say, well, if the dictator's wife was involved with that, it must be bad. Let's throw it out. Everything that had the Mubarak hand on it, let's throw it away. Now, of course, that's a problem for women in Egypt. But I bring that story up to simply illustrate the sentiment that happens when you have these words and secularism wound up with this kind of abuse of power. People often want to throw the baby out with the bathwater because the whole thing is poison for them. So the Islamist politics in Egypt and elsewhere are in fact doing what calls for secularism did to people who had had enough of institutionalized religion in bed with political power. They said, we've had enough of the abuse, let's bring in a secular model and clean it up. For a lot of these people, they've said, well, we saw what we got under so-called secularism. Now we want a different model. Now, so that's what's happening in a lot of Muslim countries. What that different model is going to look like, by the way, will work itself out in different countries very differently. Because, as I said, even about Sharia, there are a lot of controversies. What Islamist politics may mean in Tunisia may be different from Egypt and elsewhere. So we'll have to wait and see what that means. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way just because someone is a Muslim, particularly if they're not living in a country that has those issues. So this is a quote from a leading Shia religious leader. And he gave this speech at Brown University some years ago. He said, for all Muslims, the concepts of din and dunya, which are translated faith and world, are inextricably linked, more so than any other monotheistic religion. The West, nonetheless, must no longer confuse the link in Islam between temporal and spiritual with that between the state and the church. So he's saying here that that definition of the seculum, which I told you in the first slide, came out of the Catholic Church and its division between monks and the rest of us, never emerged in Islam. They didn't have this idea. But it doesn't necessarily, it has no bearing on the type of political model that they're able to adopt. That to divide religious and political power is not necessarily a problem simply because your theology was different. And now, to Abdullahi al-Naim, here without his Sudanese head wrap. This is how he normally goes to work at every university. He is the author of a book called Islam in the Secular State. He was actually here in Vancouver about a year ago to talk about this. And he actually argues that the secular state protects the ethical integrity of religion. By which he means that if you have a state which is involved in enforcing the so-called requirements of religion, such as in Saudi Arabia, for example, or in Iran, where you have the virtue police who come around and say, well, your headscarf isn't long enough, your beard isn't long enough, and so on. That in fact, people are then not following what they believe to be the requirements of their religion because they believe them to be the requirements of their religion. They're doing what they think they should do because they're afraid the guy with the stick is going to come and beat them or levy a fine or throw them in jail. And he says, well, that has no moral content whatsoever. You're not doing something because you believe in it, you're doing something because you're afraid. So in fact, he says that that actually corrupts religion. It makes it morally meaningless. So he says you need to get the state out of the business of policing people's religious duties, that is to be left to the individual and their conscience. By the way, the virtue police, we had our own version of that. I remember reading about the Puritans under Oliver Cromwell, who used to go around beating people that didn't show up in church on the Sabbath, or throwing out Christmas puddings into the street because that was deemed by Puritans at that time to be not true religion. So these things happen. He says that it's a bad thing for Muslims, and that they need to reject any version of politics that wants to incorporate religion officially and put the state in that position of enforcement.
So they think that this guy says basically God should be the guy with the stick, not some priest, right?
He thinks that you should do that between you and God. Whether or not there are sticks involved depends on your perception of God, but that's a personal problem of yours. Yes?
That was illustrated to me about 5 years ago. I knew a Sikh gentleman about my age, so we'll go back a little bit. And he didn't wear a turban or any of his 5Ks. And I asked him why, and he was very devout. He said, you're as Sikh as you want to be.
Right. The what goes on the inside is not measured by how you look on the outside necessarily. Yeah, absolutely. Abdullahi al-Naim has this quote as well. He says that the divides are not between Islam and Western society. The divide is between people who have different values, and that we have to promote connections between people who want to contribute to human values. People who share that commitment can collaborate across cultural divides. Now, I should mention he's written many other books than the one I put up there. He's got one called Islam and Human Rights. He's written copious articles, books. You can Google him and find out. He's a passionate advocate of human rights. He's the sort of guy that you would find supporting an amnesty action, right? And I think that what's important here is that he's interested in results. What is it that you're interested in working towards in the world? Not necessarily how did you get there. So if your Sikh friend, for example, and you both agree that a particular government measure is a problem, then you can work together against that measure, even though his reasons for doing that might be articulated quite differently than your own. That's the idea that Naim is talking about here. And finally, because my time is nearly up, I simply want to point out that when we're talking about Muslims and secularism, that religious identity does not determine your politics or your liberal credentials. In other words, you will find amongst religious people some really nasty patriarchal savages, just as you will find in other places. You will also find people who work towards causes that you yourself might find very important, although, as I said, they might do so from a different place. Now, this isn't the consensus I'm talking about. The guy with the religious thing on one hand saying the end is near, and the scientist saying, yes, global warming also tells us the end is near. What I mean by overlapping consensus is what John Rawls talks about, a leading political philosopher, is that we are living in diverse societies. We're living in places where we're surrounded by people who not only may look different from us, but come from radically different backgrounds and ways of viewing the world. And that's just the way it is living in the 21st century. You can't go back. So the question is, how do we live in harmonious societies with people who come from such different places? And proselytizing isn't the answer. And I think that's what Berliner Blau is saying when he talks about polarization. That trying to convince people that your final view about reality is the correct one may not necessarily be a very profitable approach to the problem. That we would be better served by focusing on ends, on common goals that we have, and find, in fact, that we may be overlapping quite a bit with people who come from very, very different places. And Muslims, perhaps surprisingly, are just as able collaborators in that regard as some others. I would just say finally here that in terms of the fact that racial identity does not determine politics, many of you may be familiar with Jen DeCrate, leading atheist blogger, and sort of her experience with very nasty, misogynistic, or very sexist attitudes within the atheist movement.
She came and talked here.
Did she?
Yeah.
So I don't have to fill in the story. The point is that, unfortunately, even when you get rid of religion, you can't necessarily get rid of all the problems in terms of attitudes to how we treat our fellow human beings that exist. And that those problems exist wherever there are people. So the good and the bad you will find both within religion and outside it. With that, I'll close.